Elderly woman finds a hole in the ground on her farm, but what was inside changes everything forever. Margaret Thompson felt her hands tremble as she held the hoe that had just struck something hard beneath the red earth. At 72, she had never found anything but stones and roots on her small banana farm in the countryside of Georgia. It was when she decided to dig a little deeper that her hoe revealed the rotten wooden lid of a buried box. The widow's heart raced. In 45 years tending that land alongside her husband Harold, and in the last 5 years alone after he passed, she had never imagined something like this could be hidden there. Good heavens, what could be in here? She murmured to herself, wiping the sweat from her brow with the back of her dirt-covered hand. Margaret looked around to make sure she was alone among the banana plants. Her closest neighbors, the Johnsons, lived more than 2 kilometers away. The feeling that she was doing something wrong bothered her, but curiosity was stronger. She knelt on the damp earth, her knees creaking in protest, and began carefully removing the soil covering the box. It was larger than she had first thought. When she managed to pull it completely from the hole, she realized it weighed much more than she expected. Margaret's hands shook as she opened the creaking lid. The smell of mold and old paper filled her nostrils. Inside, wrapped in waxed cloth, were several documents yellowed with time, old photographs, and what appeared to be handwritten letters. She picked up the first paper she could reach. It was a property deed for the farm, but it wasn't in Harold's name as it should have been. The name on the document was Thomas Edward Miller, dated 1978. Margaret felt her blood run cold. "This can't be right," she whispered, picking up another document. This second paper made her stagger back. It was an official eviction letter, ordering the Miller family to leave the property within 48 hours due to irregularities in the documentation. The letter was signed by local authorities she knew from her youth, including the former town mayor. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we're just starting out. Now continuing. Margaret stood up unsteadily, holding the papers to her chest. Her mind raced, trying to understand what those documents meant. Harold had bought the farm in 1979, just 1 year after the eviction date. Too much of a coincidence not to raise suspicions. She returned home with the box under her arm, her heart hammering in her chest. The simple 3-room cottage she had shared with Harold for decades now seemed different, as if the walls held secrets she had never known. In the kitchen, Margaret poured the entire contents of the box onto the wooden table where she ate her solitary meals. There were at least 15 different documents, some in better condition than others. A black and white photograph immediately caught her attention. It was a family smiling in front of the same house where she lived now, but the building looked newer, well kept. A young man, a beautiful woman, and 3 small children posed proudly. On the back, a delicate feminine handwriting said, "The Miller Family, 1977, Our Dream Home." Tears began to well in Margaret's eyes. That was another family's dream home. A family that had been evicted from there. A family whose place she and Harold had taken without knowing. She spent the rest of the afternoon reading document by document, letter by letter. The story emerging from those papers was devastating. Thomas Edward Miller had legally purchased the land in 1975, investing all his savings and those of his wife Mary Grace in a banana plantation that promised to sustain the family for generations. According to the documents, Thomas Edward was a simple man, a 3rd-generation farmer, who had saved for years working on other people's farms to finally have his own land. The letters between him and his wife, which Margaret found tied with a faded ribbon, revealed simple but profound dreams. "My dear Mary Grace," said one of the letters, "today I planted the first banana trees on our land. In a few years our children will be able to study in the city with the money this plantation will bring. We will manage to give them what our parents couldn't give us." Margaret wiped her eyes with the hem of her dress. The masculine handwriting continued. "Little Emily is already 3 years old and keeps asking when the bananas will grow. I told her that when she turns 5 we will have the first harvest. She was so happy that she ran off to tell her siblings. The widow felt sick, thinking that she and Harold had harvested bananas from those same trees for decades, completely ignoring the family that had planted them with so much love and hope. How had Harold never told her any of this? An official document caught her attention. It was an investigation report stating that Thomas Edward had forged land ownership documents. But something didn't add up. The dates were confused, there were different signatures for the same person on different days, and the paper seemed newer than the other documents from that time. Margaret was a simple woman who had only studied up to the 4th grade, but she wasn't foolish. After decades of helping Harold with the farm paperwork, she knew how to recognize when something was wrong in official documents. She picked up a magnifying glass she used to read medicine labels and examined the signatures more closely. Her stomach turned when she recognized a familiar handwriting in the signature of the sheriff who had authorized the eviction. It was the same handwriting as some notes she had seen Harold make in his final years of life. "It can't be," she murmured, but her voice sounded weak, even to her. Margaret ran to the room where she kept Harold's old papers. She rummaged through drawers until she found a notebook where he noted banana sales and other farm information. She returned to the kitchen and compared the handwriting of the 2 signatures under the magnifying glass. It was the same, identical. Harold had signed as the sheriff on the document that expelled the Miller family from their own land. The discovery hit her like a punch to the stomach. Margaret let herself fall into the chair, breathing with difficulty. The man she had been married to for 45 years, whom she considered honest and hard-working, had participated in a fraud that destroyed the life of an entire family. What troubled her most was realizing how many times Harold had lied over the years. Whenever she asked about how they had managed to buy the farm so cheaply, he said it had been luck, or that the previous owner was in a hurry to sell. Now she knew there was no previous owner willing to sell. There was a desperate family being forcibly evicted. Margaret stayed up all night, rereading the documents and trying to understand how her husband had gotten involved in it. Among the paperwork, she found a letter that Harold had written but apparently never sent. The recipient was Thomas Edward Miller. "Thomas Edward," the letter began with shaky handwriting, "I know you must hate me, and you have every right. What we did to your family was unforgivable. I don't go a day without thinking of your children crying when you had to leave the house. Little Emily looked so small and scared," the letter continued. "I had no choice. My family was in need, my wife was pregnant, and we lost our home in the flood. When the mayor offered me work and a chance to have our own land, I didn't think about the consequences. I only thought about saving my family." Margaret trembled reading her own husband's confession. He continued, "I know this doesn't justify anything, but I swear I thought you would receive fair compensation and find another place. I never imagined they would leave you in total misery. When I found out what really happened, it was too late to turn back." The letter ended in a way that broke Margaret's heart. "I raised my children on this land, but they know nothing. My wife doesn't know either. How can I destroy the family I built to repair the wrong I did to yours? I will carry this weight until the day I die, and I ask for forgiveness even knowing I don't deserve it." Margaret's tears wet the old paper. Harold had carried this guilt alone his entire life. Now she understood why he sometimes fell silent and melancholy for no apparent reason, especially when they walked through the banana plantation. At dawn, exhausted but determined, Margaret made a decision. She needed to find the Miller family and discover what had happened to them after the eviction. She couldn't live in peace knowing she was living on land stolen from innocent people. The first step would be to look for Mrs. Eleanor, the oldest neighbor in the area, who had lived there for over 60 years. If anyone knew what had happened to the Millers, it would be her. Margaret dressed carefully, wearing her nicest going-out clothes, a navy blue dress she wore to Sunday Mass. She needed to make a good impression if she wanted Mrs. Eleanor to talk openly about the past. The walk to the neighbor's house took almost an hour. Mrs. Eleanor, at 84, still tended her vegetable garden and some chickens by herself. She received Margaret with surprise, as the two didn't have the habit of visiting often. "Margaret, dear, what an unexpected visit. Come in, come in. I just made coffee." The two sat on the simple porch of Mrs. Eleanor's house. Margaret accepted a small coffee and spent a few minutes making conversation about the weather and the harvest, gathering courage to ask the questions that really mattered. "Mrs. Eleanor," she began cautiously, "you've lived here so long. You must remember a lot of what happened in the area." "I do remember, my dear. My head still works well, thank God. Why do you ask?" "It's just that I was digging in the yard yesterday and got curious about who lived in my house before us. Harold never said much about it." Mrs. Eleanor's face changed immediately. The friendly expression gave way to something more cautious, almost fearful. "Oh, my dear, that was a long time ago. It's not worth stirring up the past. But do you remember anything? Just curiosity, really." Mrs. Eleanor stood up abruptly, collecting the coffee cups, even though they weren't empty. "Look, Margaret, some things are better left alone. Harold was a good man. You've always been good neighbours. No need to go looking for trouble." Mrs. Eleanor's reaction confirmed Margaret's suspicions. The neighbour knew something but didn't want to talk. This only increased her determination to discover the truth. "Mrs. Eleanor, I found some old things buried in the yard. Papers from a family named Miller. Did you know them?" The elderly woman stopped moving. For a few seconds she was completely still, looking at the ground. When she raised her eyes, Margaret saw tears forming. "My dear, why did you go digging into those things? Some wounds are better left to heal." "Because I need to know, Mrs. Eleanor. I've lived in that house for decades, and now I find out that maybe I shouldn't be there. I need to understand what happened." Mrs. Eleanor sat back down heavily. She took a deep breath before she began to speak. "The Millers were good people, Margaret. Thomas Edward was hard-working, honest. Mary Grace was a sweet woman. She helped everyone in need. They had 3 little children. What happened to them? One night, some men arrived saying they had to leave, that the land papers were fake. Thomas Edward showed the deed, showed he had bought everything properly, but it was no use. They said it was all forged." Mrs. Eleanor wiped her eyes with a handkerchief she took from her apron pocket. "The youngest girl, Emily, had a high fever that night. It was the middle of winter. It was bitterly cold. They had nowhere to go. Thomas Edward begged them to let them stay at least until the girl got better, but there was no way. And then they had to leave with just the clothes on their backs. They managed to take a few things in a borrowed cart, but most of the furniture and belongings were left behind. They ended up here at my house that first night." Margaret felt her heart tighten, imagining that desperate family being thrown out of their home in the middle of the night. Mary Grace was 4 months pregnant, but she lost the baby a few days later. The doctor said it was the shock and the stress of the situation. Thomas Edward never forgave himself for not being able to protect his family. Where did they go to live? "They stayed here at my house for a few weeks. Then they got a little shack on the outskirts of town. Thomas Edward found work at a brickyard, but the salary was barely enough to eat. Emily got sick again, pneumonia this time. With no money for a private doctor and the public health system as precarious as it's always been." Mrs. Eleanor couldn't finish the sentence. Margaret understood what had happened without needing to hear the words. "The girl didn't make it?" "No, my dear. Emily was only 3 years old. After they lost their daughter, the family fell apart. Mary Grace fell into a deep depression. The 2 boys went to live with relatives in other cities." Margaret covered her face with her hands. Little Emily, who had planted the banana trees with her father, who was eager to see the first harvest, had passed away because of an injustice her own husband had helped commit. "And Thomas Edward? Mary Grace?" "Thomas Edward still lives in town. He works as a recyclable materials collector despite his age. He lives in a small house in the hardship district. Mary Grace, she never recovered from the loss of her daughter. She wasted away slowly and passed about 15 years ago. The silence that followed was broken only by the singing of birds and the wind rustling the leaves of the trees. Margaret felt as if the weight of the world was on her shoulders. "Mrs. Eleanor, why did no one ever say anything? Why did no one report what happened? My dear, it was a different time. The mayor, the sheriff, the judge, they were all part of the same little clique. Who would believe the word of a simple farmer against all those people? Besides, Thomas Edward tried to pursue his rights. But the original papers disappeared mysteriously from the county clerk's office." Margaret said goodbye to Mrs. Eleanor, promising she wouldn't cause trouble for anyone, but with her mind already made up by a decision. She needed to find Thomas Edward and discover if there was any way to repair, even partially, the wrong that had been done. On the way back home, she stopped at the banana plantation and looked at the trees with new eyes. Every banana tree there had been planted by Thomas Edward's hands, watered with the sweat and dreams of a family that had lost everything. That afternoon, Margaret went into town for the first time in months. The hardship district was on the outskirts, an area she knew little about. The houses were simple, many still unfinished, with small backyards where families tried to plant something to supplement their food. She asked a few people on the street until she found Thomas Edward Miller's house. It was a small two-room shack with an asbestos cement roof and unplastered brick walls. In the yard, a thin, greying man was sorting plastic bottles, cans, and cardboard. When he lifted his eyes and saw Margaret standing at the gate, his face completely transformed. The recognition was immediate and painful. "I knew that one day you would come here," said Thomas Edward, dropping the bottle he had in his hands. Margaret felt her legs weaken. He knew her. He knew who she was and where she lived. "Mr. Miller, I need to speak with you." "You may come in. I don't have much to offer, but there's a chair in the shade." They sat under a small tree that Thomas Edward had planted in the yard. The awkwardness was palpable, but there was something more in the man's expression. It wasn't anger or resentment as Margaret had expected. It was a deep and resigned sadness. "I found the box," Margaret said directly. Thomas Edward nodded slowly. "I buried it one night, a few months after we were expelled. I went back there secretly to get some things that had been left behind and took the chance to bury the documents. I thought that one day they might be useful for something." "Why did you never seek justice? Never try to get the land back?" Thomas Edward let out a bitter laugh. "I tried, yes. I spent the last few pennies I had on a lawyer, but all the original papers had disappeared from the county offices. Without proof, it was my word against theirs, and there were many of them, powerful people. I was just a poor farmer. But now we have the papers from the box. They are proof of what happened." "Mrs. Margaret," said Thomas Edward, looking directly into her eyes, "do you really want to stir up this whole story? It will bring suffering to a lot of people, and it won't bring my Emily back." The mention of his daughter made Margaret choke up. She had rehearsed that conversation the whole way there, but she wasn't prepared for the man's painful serenity. "I need to do something. I can't live knowing I'm on land that isn't mine, that was stolen from your family. The land is yours now, Mrs. Margaret. You have lived there honestly for decades, taken good care of it. I never held any anger toward you or your husband. My anger was always for those who plotted the whole thing." "But it's not fair." "Fair?" Thomas Edward interrupted gently. "Fair would be my Emily being alive, my wife not having died of a broken heart, my children having grown up on the land where they were born. Nothing you do will bring that back." Margaret began to cry. Thomas Edward's gentleness and resignation were even harder to bear than anger would have been. "But I can give the land back to you. It's the least I can do." "And then what? A 72-year-old woman will live where? Work how? Will your children understand? Will you be able to forgive yourself for destroying your own family, to try to repair an injustice that wasn't even your fault?" Thomas Edward got up and went to fetch 2 bottles of water. He offered one to Margaret before continuing. "Besides, I am 75 years old. I no longer have the strength or the knowledge to run a farm. My children have made their lives far from here. They have their own families. This whole story would only bring pain to everyone." "Then what do I do? How do I live with this?" "The same thing I've been doing for 45 years, Mrs. Margaret. Learn to carry the weight and try to be a better person each day." The two remained silent for a few minutes. Margaret tried to process everything she was hearing. The solution she had imagined, simply returning the land, was not so simple. "Your husband was a good man," Thomas Edward said unexpectedly. "How can you say that?" "Because he looked for me, about 10 years after everything happened. He came here, to this very tree, and cried like a child asking for my forgiveness. He said not a day went by without him thinking of Emily." Margaret was surprised. Harold had sought out Thomas Edward and had never told her anything about it. "He offered money, offered a piece of the land, offered everything he had, but I didn't want to accept anything. I knew he was suffering as much as I was, each in our own way. The difference is that he could do something to ease his conscience, and I could only learn to live with the pain. Why didn't you accept anything? Because it would seem like I was selling the memory of my daughter. Besides, his family needed those things too. You had children to raise, a life to live. It wasn't fair for me to ruin your lives to ease my pain. Margaret realized that Thomas Edward was a much wiser and more generous man than she had imagined. The anger and resentment she expected to find didn't exist. In their place was a mature sadness and a deep understanding of life's complexity. But something needs to be done, insisted Margaret. Yes, it does. But not necessarily what you're thinking. What do you suggest? Thomas Edward looked at the horizon before answering. My Emily always dreamed of seeing those banana trees grow. She died before seeing the first harvest. If you really want to do something for me, let me visit the plantation from time to time. Let me tell her how beautiful the trees have become. The simplicity of the request touched Margaret deeply. She had imagined grand gestures of reparation, but Thomas Edward wanted only the chance to visit the symbolic grave of his daughter. Of course you can. You can go there whenever you want. And maybe you could plant a new tree for Emily. One that's just hers, so I can tend to it when I visit. Margaret nodded through her tears. Let's plant it together. And so began an unlikely friendship between the widow who had discovered she was living on stolen land and the man who had lost everything because of it. In the days that followed, Thomas Edward began visiting the farm regularly, always in the late afternoon, when he finished his work as a collector. They planted a small jabuticaba tree in the spot where the box with the documents had been buried. Thomas Edward explained that Emily loved jabuticaba and always asked Mary Grace to make sweets from the fruit. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we're just starting out. Now continuing. During these visits, Thomas Edward told stories about his family and about what life was like on the farm before the eviction. Margaret learned that Mary Grace's old vegetable garden was exactly where she now kept her chicken coop, that the eldest boy, John, had built a tree house in the tree that still stood at the back of the property. These conversations brought a human dimension to something Margaret had begun to see only as a legal or moral issue. The Miller family was no longer an abstraction, but real people with dreams, fears, and joys like anyone else. A month after meeting Thomas Edward, Margaret decided to tell the story to her children. She arranged a Sunday lunch with the three of them: Robert, 48, who lived in the capital and worked at an accounting firm; Jennifer, 45, a teacher in a neighboring town; and David, 42, who had stayed in the region and worked as a mechanic. The revelation caused very different reactions in the three children. Robert, always practical, immediately worried about the legal implications. Jennifer was moved and wanted to meet Thomas Edward. David reacted with anger, feeling his mother was stirring up a hornet's nest unnecessarily. "Mom, why did you go digging up these things?" asked David, agitated. "Father is already dead. He can't defend himself. Why destroy his memory now?" "I'm not destroying your father's memory," Margaret replied calmly. "I'm trying to understand who he really was, with qualities and flaws. And if this story gets out, and if that man decides to sue the family, have you thought that we could lose everything?" Robert, who had been quiet until then, intervened. "David, according to the documents Mother showed, any legal action expired decades ago. Legally, we're not at risk." "It's not a question of legal risk," said Jennifer. "It's a question of doing what's right." "Right according to whom?" David countered. "The whole family worked that land for decades. I grew up there. You all did too. Our children played there. Now Mother wants to throw it all away because of an old story?" The discussion lasted all afternoon. Margaret realized each child was reacting according to their personality and life situation. Robert, always cautious, wanted to evaluate all options before making any decision. Jennifer, an educator and sensitive, identified with the Miller family's suffering. David, who had built his life in the region, feared the social consequences of stirring up the past. "Listen," said Margaret, when the debate was getting too heated. I didn't ask for your opinions to take a vote. I asked to let you know what I intend to do. This is my decision." "And what do you intend to do?" asked Robert. "I'm still figuring it out, but I know I won't pretend nothing happened." In the following days, the family tension persisted. David avoided visiting his mother. Jennifer called every day to see how she was, and Robert promised to come the next weekend to talk properly about the situation. It was during this tense week that Margaret made a discovery that completely changed her perspective on the whole situation. She was organizing the documents from the box when she found a letter that had gone unnoticed during the first reading. It was from Mary Grace to a sister, dated a few months before the eviction. "Dear Linda," the letter said, "I'm worried about some men who showed up here asking about our land papers. They said it was routine, but Thomas Edward became suspicious. He went to the city to speak with the lawyer who handled the purchase, but the man said he couldn't see him because he was busy with an important case." The letter continued, "What troubles me most is that our neighbor, Mrs. Eleanor, mentioned she heard strange conversations in town about several families who bought land in the region. It seems someone is questioning the validity of the deeds. Thomas Edward doesn't want to worry me, but I see he hasn't been sleeping well." Further on, Mary Grace wrote, "Linda, do you know anyone in the capital who understands laws? Thomas Edward is thinking of taking our documents to someone to examine. We spent all our savings to buy this land. We can't lose everything now. The boys are growing up. Emily is starting to speak properly. This is our home." The letter ended prophetically. "Sometimes I have nightmares about men coming to take us away in the middle of the night. I wake up sweating and go check if the children are all right. God willing, it's all just in my head." Margaret felt sick reading that. Mary Grace had sensed what was coming. The family hadn't been caught completely by surprise. They knew something was wrong, but they didn't have the resources or knowledge to protect themselves. This discovery motivated her to investigate more deeply. If other families had also been harmed, perhaps the situation was much bigger than she had initially imagined. Margaret spent the following days talking with older neighbors, always discreetly. What she discovered shocked her. At least 6 families in the region had gone through similar situations around the same time. They had all bought land legally. They were all accused of document forgery. They all lost their properties. Mrs. Dorothy, 89 years old, said her family had also been victims of the same scheme. They managed to stay on the land because her father was a war veteran and had influential contacts, but they witnessed several families being unjustly evicted. "It was a very organized scheme," explained Mrs. Dorothy. "They identified families who had bought good land for low prices, found a way to question the documentation, and then sold the land to other people for higher amounts." "And no one ever reported it?" "My dear, who was going to report it? The scheme involved the mayor, the police chief, the judge, the notary offices. It was the entire public power. The harmed families were simple folk, without resources, without knowledge of their rights." "But how did my husband get involved in this?" Mrs. Dorothy hesitated before answering. "Harold wasn't a criminal, Margaret. He was a victim of circumstances, just like the others. The difference is that they offered him a chance to save his own family, and he accepted." "How so?" "Your family was also going to be evicted. You lived in a small rented house that had documentation problems. The mayor offered Harold work and his own land in exchange for him helping with the legal process for some rural properties." The revelation hit Margaret like a bolt of lightning. Harold had also been a victim of the same corrupt system. The difference was that he had agreed to become part of the scheme to protect his own family. Didn't he know he would harm innocent people? "In the beginning, I don't think so. They probably told him it was all legal, that the families would be relocated to better places. When he realized the truth, he was already too involved to get out." This new perspective on Harold complicated Margaret's feelings even more. She couldn't decide whether she should feel more compassion or more disappointment in her husband. Over the weekend, when Robert came to visit her, Margaret shared all these discoveries with her son. He listened to everything in silence, taking notes from time to time. "Mom, this changes everything," he said at the end. "If there really was a larger scheme, involving several families, maybe it's still possible to do something." "What do you mean?" Crimes against public property never expire. If we can prove there was corruption involving public officials, it's still possible to sue the responsible parties who are still alive. But won't that cause suffering for a lot of innocent people? People who bought land without knowing it was stolen? Robert thought for a few minutes before answering. Mum, there are ways to seek justice without harming the innocent. For example, suing the state for compensation to the harmed families, instead of trying to reverse all the sales. The idea seemed fairer to Margaret. Instead of taking land from families who had worked on it honestly for decades, it would be possible to seek financial reparation for the original victims. But that would be very expensive for the government, wouldn't it? It would, but it's the state's responsibility to repair damages caused by corruption of its own employees. Besides, we're not talking about absurd amounts. 6 or 7 families, compensation based on the current value of the lands. It's feasible. Margaret felt more hopeful. Perhaps there was a way to achieve justice without destroying anyone's life. Do you know any lawyer who could help us? Yes, I do. A college friend who works with human rights. He wouldn't charge anything if the case is really solid. By the end of that Sunday, mother and son had drawn up a plan. Robert would take copies of all the documents to New York and consult his lawyer friend. If there were a legal basis for a lawsuit, they would seek out the other affected families to see if they were interested in pursuing joint reparations. The following week was one of anxiety for Margaret. She continued to receive visits from Thomas Edward, but she hadn't yet told him about the possibility of legal action. She wanted to be more certain before raising expectations. Thomas Edward had become a constant and comforting presence in her life. He would appear every afternoon, help with small tasks on the farm, tend to Emily's little tree, and talk about life in general. It was during one of these conversations that Margaret discovered Thomas Edward had 2 living sons. John, the eldest, was an engineer and lived in Atlanta. Charles, the middle one, had become a teacher and worked in a small town in the interior of New York. Do you keep in touch with them? Not much. They've built their lives far from here. They have their own families. I don't like to be a bother. But do they know the whole story? Yes, they do. John even tried to convince me a few times to look for a lawyer to try and recover something. But I always thought it was too late. And what if it weren't too late? Thomas Edward looked at Margaret with curiosity. What are you plotting, ma'am? Margaret told him about the conversations with Robert and the possibility of seeking legal redress. Thomas Edward listened to everything in silence, nodding his head from time to time. Mrs. Margaret, I'm too old for fights. I don't want to spend my last years chasing after lawyers and courtrooms. You wouldn't be the one chasing. It would be my son handling everything. You would only need to tell your story. And what would I want money for now? To buy what? To leave to whom? For your sons, for your grandchildren? To show that the injustice done to your family will not go unpunished forever. Thomas Edward became thoughtful. Margaret realized she had touched a sensitive point when she mentioned the sons and grandchildren. Let me talk to John and Charles. If they think it's worth it, I'm in. That Thursday, Robert called with news. The lawyer had analyzed the documents and confirmed there was a solid basis for a reparations lawsuit against the state. He wants to speak in person with Mr. Thomas Edward and with 1 or 2 more affected families. If we can get at least 3 well-documented cases, we can file a class action. And how long would that take? Several years, probably. But the important thing is the families wouldn't need to spend anything. The lawyer would work on a contingency basis. He would only receive fees if he secured the compensation. Margaret relayed the information to Thomas Edward on his next visit. To her surprise, he seemed more interested this time. John called last night. We talked about it. He said, if I don't do anything now, my grandchildren will never know their grandfather was wronged, that his family had their own land. He's right. So you agree to participate? I do. But on one condition, I don't want you to feel obligated to help. You've already done more than you should have by taking me in here. Mr. Thomas, I'm not helping out of obligation. I'm helping because it's the right thing to do. In the months that followed, Margaret's life changed completely. The farm became a meeting point for other families harmed by the corruption scheme. Mrs. Helen, who had lost a small property in 1979, came every week with new documents she found at home. Mr. Henry, namesake of Margaret's son, whose father had been evicted from a coffee farm, brought similar stories of document forgery. The search for justice had created a support network among people who had carried similar wounds for decades. For Margaret, who had lived alone since Harold's departure, this activity brought a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in years. The legal proceedings advanced more quickly than expected. The attorney, Dr. Richard, discovered that several of the forged documents had been made by the same forger, a man who had confessed to other crimes before passing away in the 90s. The forged signatures were confirmed by graphological analysis. More importantly, some of the public officials involved in the scheme were still alive. The former mayor, now 78, lived in a mansion in Atlanta. The former head of the notary's office had retired wealthy and maintained several rural properties. They enriched themselves for decades with the proceeds of the criminal scheme, explained Dr. Richard in a meeting at Margaret's farm. We can prove the illicit origin of their assets. The first hearing of the case took place on a Tuesday in July. Margaret, Thomas Edward, and 6 other affected people attended the county courthouse. It was the first time Thomas Edward had entered a courtroom since the failed attempt to recover his land 40 years earlier. The media coverage of the case in the local press was greater than expected. A young reporter from the regional newspaper became interested in the story and began investigating other similar cases on his own. Within a few weeks, he had documented more than 15 families that may have been victims of the same scheme. David, Margaret's son, who had initially opposed the search for the truth, changed his mind when he saw his mother being interviewed on local television. The report presented her as a hero of justice, a courageous elderly woman who had chosen to do what was right, even knowing it could harm her own family. "I'm sorry, Mom," said David during an emotional visit. "I was wrong. You are doing something important." "You weren't wrong, my son. You were protecting the family, as you always have. But sometimes protecting the family means teaching that values are more important than material possessions." The state's response to the lawsuit was also surprising. Instead of denying the accusations, the Attorney General's office reached an agreement to acknowledge responsibility for the acts of the corrupt officials. They offered full compensation to all affected families, calculated based on the current value of the lands, plus moral damages. Thomas Edward would receive the equivalent of nearly 300,000 rees. The other families, amounts proportional to what they had lost. For a man who earned less than a minimum wage collecting recyclable materials, it was a sum that would completely change his quality of life. "Mrs. Margaret," he said on the night they learned of the agreement, "I don't even know what to do with so much money. You can buy a better house, you can help your children, you can travel to meet your grandchildren. I can do many things, but do you know what I want to do most? What? I want to buy a small plot of land and plant a vegetable garden. I want to be a farmer again, even if on a small scale. It's what I know how to do. It's who I am." Margaret smiled. Even after decades of suffering, Thomas Edward had not lost his essence. The compensation process took nearly 2 years to complete. During that time, the relationship between Margaret and Thomas Edward evolved from a friendship based on guilt to a genuine partnership. Thomas Edward became a sort of informal caretaker of the farm. He helped with the heavier work, took care of the crops when Margaret needed to be away, and his visits brought a liveliness she hadn't felt in years. In return, Margaret helped him reconnect with his children. John and Charles began visiting their father regularly, bringing grandchildren Thomas Edward barely knew. The farm became a meeting point for the reunited family. The jabuticaba tree planted in memory of Emily grew strong and healthy. In the second year, it bore its first fruits. Thomas Edward Miller cried when he harvested the first ripe jabuticabas, remembering the dreams of his daughter who never got to grow up. It was under that tree that he made a decision that surprised everyone. "Mrs. Margaret, I want to split the compensation with you." "Don't be foolish, Thomas Edward. That money is rightfully yours. It's rightfully mine. But I want to split it by choice. You could have pretended you never found that box. You could have burned the documents and kept on living in peace. Instead, you chose to seek justice even knowing it would cause problems for your own family. I only did what any decent person would do. You don't know people like I do. After losing everything, I learned that most people only do what's convenient for them. You did what was right. That's worth more than money." Margaret tried to refuse, but Thomas Edward was unyielding. He insisted on transferring half of his compensation to her, arguing that without her courage to seek the truth, he would never have gotten any reparation. "Besides," he said with a smile, "I'm too old to spend so much money alone. I'd rather see you use some of it to improve the farm, plant new things, maybe build a better house." With the unexpected compensation, Margaret was able to make renovations to the house, modernize the plantation's irrigation system, and even buy a small tractor to make the work easier. More importantly, she created a fund to help other rural families in the region who were going through hardships. The case gained statewide notoriety and became an example of how to seek justice through legal means. Dr. Richard was invited to lecture at universities about reparation for historical injustices. Thomas Edward and Margaret were honored by the city council. But for them, the most important thing wasn't the honors or the money. It was the peace of mind that came with the feeling that they had done what was right. 3 years after finding the buried box, Margaret was preparing lunch when she heard familiar voices in the backyard. It was Thomas Edward teaching his grandchildren how to plant banana seedlings in the new part of the farm, which he had helped expand with his share of the compensation. "Grandpa, why does Mrs. Margaret let us plant on her farm?" asked the youngest granddaughter, only 6 years old. "Because she understood something very important, my dear. The land doesn't belong to anyone forever. We only take care of it for a while and then we pass it on. The important thing is to take good care of it and leave it better for those who come after." Margaret smiled, hearing the explanation. Thomas Edward had found a simple way to teach the children complex lessons about justice, forgiveness, and responsibility. That afternoon, the two were sitting on the porch, watching the children play among the banana plants, when Thomas Edward asked a question Margaret didn't expect. "Mrs. Margaret, don't you regret having disturbed that box?" "Why would I regret it?" "Because your life was peaceful. You could have lived the rest of your days in peace, not knowing any of this." Margaret thought for a few minutes before answering. "Thomas Edward, I lived 67 years without knowing who my husband really was. I thought I knew our story, our family, our life. Discovering the truth hurt me a lot, but it also freed me." "Freed you from what?" "From living a lie, from loving an edited version of a person. Now I love the complete Harold, with his mistakes and regrets. It's a more real, more honest love." "And the farm? Wasn't it nicer when you thought it was only yours?" "It was simpler, but it wasn't nicer. Now when I look at the banana trees, I don't just see my work and Harold's. I see Mary Grace's dream. Emily's small hands helping her father plant, the hope of leaving something for the children. The land holds more history, more meaning." Thomas Edward Miller nodded in understanding. "You have transformed a land of guilt into a land of memory. And you helped me turn a painful discovery into an opportunity for justice." Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to leave a like, and especially to subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we're just starting out. Now continuing, the two fell into a comfortable silence, watching the sun set between the banana trees. In the place where there once was a hole hiding painful secrets, now grew a fruit tree that nourished a new generation. The story of Margaret and Thomas Edward spread through the region and reached other parts of the country. They received letters from people who had been through similar situations, some seeking advice, others simply sharing their own stories of injustice and reparation. One of the most touching letters came from a woman in North Carolina whose grandfather had lost land under similar circumstances in the 50s. She wrote that she had found old documents in the attic and was considering seeking justice inspired by the story she saw on television. Margaret and Thomas Edward began personally responding to these letters, offering emotional support and contacts for specialized lawyers. Without realizing it, they had become a kind of informal support center for victims of historical land injustices. Dr. Richard approached them with an interesting proposal to turn their experiences into a pilot project for a state program for the reparation of historical rural injustices. "You have proven that it's possible to seek justice without creating new injustices," explained the lawyer. "The model of compensation instead of property reversion could be applied to hundreds of similar cases across the state." Margaret felt honored by the proposal, but also a little intimidated by the responsibility. "Doctor, I'm just a retired homemaker. I don't know if I have the knowledge to help with a program like this. Mrs. Thompson, you have something more valuable than technical knowledge, real experience and moral credibility. People trust you because they know your motivation is genuine. Thomas Edward was also invited to participate in the project, sharing his perspective as a victim who managed to find peace through restorative justice. The pilot program was launched 6 months later, with Margaret and Thomas Edward as special consultants. They traveled to several towns in the countryside, telling their story and guiding other families on how to document cases of historical injustice. During one of these trips, they visited a town where 5 families had been evicted in the same week in 1981. The pattern was identical to what had happened in their region: forged documentation, corrupt officials, poor families without the resources to defend themselves. It's astonishing how the same scheme was applied in different places, commented Thomas Edward on the way back. What amazes me most is seeing how people carry pain for decades, thinking they can't do anything, replied Margaret. How many families could have found some peace if they knew it was possible to seek reparation? This reflection motivated them to propose an expansion of the program. Instead of waiting for the wronged families to come to them, they began active work to identify cases through historical records and community testimonies. The work was arduous but rewarding. With every family they managed to help, Margaret felt she was honoring not only the memory of Emily and Mary Grace, but all victims of injustices who never had the chance to seek reparation. Thomas Edward proved to be a natural investigator. His life experience and ability to converse with simple people made him especially effective in obtaining testimonies and documents that families had kept for decades. After losing everything, I learned to truly listen to people, he explained in an interview for a state magazine. When you have suffered greatly, you can recognize the suffering of others and make them feel comfortable to speak. The project gained national recognition. Margaret and Thomas Edward were invited to speak at the National Congress about historical reparation policies. For a woman who had spent her entire life taking care of the home and plantation, speaking to representatives and senators was a surreal experience. "Honorable members of Congress," said Margaret in her speech, "justice is not only about punishing those who do wrong. Justice is also about repairing the wrong that was done. We cannot change the past, but we can choose what kind of future we will build." The repercussion of the speech led to the approval of a state law creating a permanent fund for the reparation of historical land injustices. The fund would be sustained by fines applied in corruption cases and by a percentage of the state budget. 5 years after finding the buried box, Margaret became one of the most respected people in the state, in the area of rural justice. She received honorary citizen titles in several cities and was decorated by the state government. But she never strayed from her roots. She continued living in the same house, tending to the same plantation, receiving Thomas Edward for afternoon conversations. The difference was that now the farm received visitors from across the country who came to learn about the model case of historical reparation. Thomas Edward used his portion of the compensation not only to buy the home he had always dreamed of, but also to create a small aid fund for struggling rural families in the region. Every week he visited small farmers offering financial support to those in need. "I know what it's like to have nowhere to run when everything goes wrong," he would say. "If I can prevent other families from going through that, it's the least I can do." The Jabuticaba tree planted in memory of Emily became a place of pilgrimage for families who had found justice through the program. People came from far away to leave flowers or simply sit in silence under the tree, honoring not only Emily, but all victims of historical injustices. Margaret established a tradition. Every year on Emily's birthday, which would be March 15th, she and Thomas Edward organized a small gathering at the farm. Families who had benefited from the program came to share food and stories. It was a celebration of the life Emily could have had and the justice she never got to see. During one of these gatherings, Thomas Edward's granddaughter, now 10 years old, asked a question that deeply touched those present. "Grandpa, if Emily were still alive, do you think she would like what you did?" Thomas Edward wiped his eyes before answering, "I think she would be happy, yes. Emily was always a fair girl. Even as a little girl, she didn't like when something was unfair, I think she would approve of us fighting so other children wouldn't go through what she went through." Margaret added, "Emily planted the first banana saplings on this land with her own little hands. In a way, everything that grew here afterward has a little bit of her, and now, through our work, her memory is helping other families. She is still planting hope." As the years passed, the historical reparation program expanded to other states. The model developed from the experience of Margaret and Thomas Edward was adapted for different regional contexts, always maintaining the fundamental principles: to seek justice without creating new injustices, to prioritize reparation over punishment, and to honor the dignity of both the victims and those who had involuntarily benefited from unjust systems. Margaret, now 79, remained active in the program, but had passed most of the operational responsibilities to a younger team. Her role was mainly advisory and symbolic, but still fundamental to maintaining the project's credibility and humanitarian focus. Thomas Edward, at 82, maintained the surprising energy of someone who had found a renewed purpose in life. He had become a kind of informal oral historian, documenting stories of rural injustices that risked being forgotten with the passing of the older generations. Margaret's farm had transformed into an informal center for studies on rural justice. University students came to do research, journalists sought to understand the phenomenon of historical reparation, and policymakers visited to understand how public policies could be implemented in a more humane and effective way. But for Margaret, the most rewarding aspect of that entire journey was not the honors or recognition. It was the peace she had found with herself and with the memory of Harold. "Before finding that box," she said in an interview for a documentary, "I lived in a simplified version of my own story. Now I live in the complete version, and it's much better this way, even though it's more painful." The documentary, titled The Land of Truth, was shown at several festivals and won awards for Best Documentary on Human Rights. But Margaret and Thomas Edward insisted that all income from the film be directed to the Reparation Fund, maintaining consistency with their philosophy of using their experiences to benefit others. One winter morning, 7 years after the discovery of the box, Thomas Edward arrived at the farm earlier than usual. He found Margaret in the kitchen making coffee and sat at the table where, years before, she had first spread out the documents that changed their lives. "Mrs. Margaret, I have a confession to make." She looked at him curiously. After so many years of friendship, what secret could he still be keeping? "I lied to you that first day when I said I had buried the box a few months after the eviction." "What do you mean?" "I didn't bury the box. It was Mary Grace. On the eve of our expulsion, she suspected we wouldn't be able to return to get our things, so she buried the most important documents in the yard during the night." Margaret was intrigued. Why had he lied about that? "I didn't tell the truth because it was too painful to admit that my wife was braver and more foresighted than I was. While I still believed we could solve everything legally, she already knew we were lost. She was the one who had the wisdom to preserve the evidence." Thomas Edward wiped his eyes. "Everything we achieved in justice afterward, you finding the documents, our lawsuit, our friendship, all of that was possible because Mary Grace had the courage to act when I was still paralyzed by denial. Why are you telling me this now?" "Because I want to plant a second tree next to Emily's Jabuticaba tree, a tree for Mary Grace. She deserves to be remembered too." Margaret was moved. With each passing year, Thomas Edward found new ways to honor the family he had lost, always including her in these rituals of memory. "What tree do you think would be appropriate for her?" Thomas Edward smiled for the first time in that conversation. "A pomegranate tree. Mary Grace loved pomegranates. He said it was the most generous fruit in the world because it had so many seeds, so many possibilities for new life." The next day they planted a small pomegranate sapling together. During the simple ceremony, Thomas Edward Miller shared stories about Mary Grace that he had never shared before. Her ability to find beauty in difficult situations, her generosity with neighbors in need, her strength in keeping the family united during the hard times that preceded the eviction. "She had a saying," Thomas Edward recounted as he watered the newly planted sapling. "Life doesn't just give us what we deserve, it also gives us what we manage to transform. I think she would be proud to see how we've transformed our pain into something useful for other people." The pomegranate tree took root quickly in the red earth of the farm. In the 3rd year it bore its first fruits, small and sweet. Thomas Edward made a point of taking some pomegranates to his sons, telling them about the tribute to their mother, and how the farm had become a place of living memory instead of just buried suffering. John and Charles, who now visited their father regularly, suggested creating a more formal memorial at the spot where their sister and mother were honored. They wanted to install a plaque explaining the story and turn that little corner of the farm into a space for reflection on justice and reconciliation. Margaret supported the idea, but suggested the memorial be broader, honoring not just the Miller family, but all victims of land injustices in the region. The plaque could tell the overall story of the corruption scheme and explain how the search for truth and reparation had transformed pain into positive action. The memorial was inaugurated in a simple but moving ceremony. Representatives from all the families who benefited from the reparation program attended, along with local authorities who supported the project, and even some of the students who had done research at the farm. Dr. Richard, the lawyer who had handled the original case, gave a speech highlighting how the case had established important jurisprudence for transitional justice issues in the United States. What began as the accidental discovery of a buried box became a national model for how to deal with historical injustices constructively, he said. You have proven it's possible to seek truth and reparation without cycles of vengeance. But the most emotional moment of the ceremony was when Thomas Edward's great-granddaughter, a 4-year-old girl, placed flowers at the 2 trees planted in memory of Emily and Mary Grace. She didn't fully understand the story, but she understood that this was a special place where important people were remembered with affection. "Grandpa Thomas," the little girl asked, "can Emily and Grandma Mary Grace see the flowers I left?" Thomas Edward knelt down to be at the child's level. "I think they can, my dear granddaughter. They can see through the fruits of the trees, through the other families who found justice, through every person who learns their story and decides to do something good in the world." That night, after all the visitors had left, Margaret and Thomas Edward sat in silence at the memorial. The full moon illuminated the 2 trees and the flowers left by the great-granddaughter. "Thomas Edward," Margaret said, "sometimes I think about what our lives would have been like if I had never found that box. What would they have been? I would have lived my final years in peace, but a peace based on ignorance. You would have died poor and bitter, never seeing justice done. Our families would never have met. Hundreds of other families would never have received reparation. And what does that make you think? That sometimes life puts us in difficult situations not to punish us, but to give us the chance to be better than we thought we could be." Thomas Edward nodded thoughtfully. "Mrs. Margaret, may I ask an indiscreet question?" "Of course. Do you feel guilty for having been happy for so many years in a land that wasn't yours?" The question caught Margaret by surprise. It was something she had asked herself many times, but had never openly discussed. "In the beginning I felt it deeply, but I learned that guilt is a useless feeling if it doesn't lead to action. I turned guilt into responsibility, responsibility into action, and action into justice. Now I feel at peace." "And what about Harold? Can you forgive him?" "To forgive presupposes there was a betrayal. But Harold never betrayed me. He protected our family the only way he knew how, in an impossible situation. If anyone needs forgiveness, it's us, for having unintentionally benefited from the suffering of others." "And do you forgive yourself?" Margaret thought for a long time before answering. "I forgive myself for not having known. I do not forgive myself for having thought of staying silent when I found out. I forgive myself for having hesitated, and I am proud for having chosen to do what was right." The conversation was interrupted by a noise in the chicken coop. Thomas Edward got up to investigate and found it was just an armadillo looking for worms. When he returned, he found Margaret smiling. "Why are you smiling?" "I was thinking that 8 years ago I lived on a quiet farm, just me and the chickens. Today I live on a farm full of stories, of people, of purpose. It's funny how finding the truth, even when it's painful, can make life richer." "Don't you miss the tranquility of before?" "I do. But I prefer the productive restlessness of now to the ignorant tranquility of before. Besides," she said, looking at Thomas Edward, "I gained a true friend in all of this." "I gained one too, And I gained something more important: proof that there are still people willing to make sacrifices for what is right. After losing everything unjustly, I had lost faith in humanity. You gave me back that faith. The two of them watched the stars in comfortable silence. The farm slept peacefully around them, but it was no longer the same place where Margaret had lived her whole life. It was transformed by truth, by justice, and especially by the unexpected friendship that had been born from the courage to face the past. 8 years after finding the buried box, Margaret received a call that would once again change her perspective on the whole story. It was from a young woman, a lawyer, who introduced herself as the granddaughter of Mary Grace. "My name is Emily Helen, Mrs. Margaret. I am the daughter of John, granddaughter of Thomas Edward. My father gave me your phone number." Margaret nearly dropped the phone. Emily Helen. The name couldn't be a coincidence. "My father named me that in honor of my aunt who died young. I grew up hearing the family story, but only now, after graduating from law school, did I decide to delve into everything that happened. What can I do for you, dear?" "I would like to visit you and talk. I'm writing a book about your case, but I want it to be more than a legal account. I want it to be a book about people, about how justice can heal old wounds." Emily Helen's visit was scheduled for the following weekend. Thomas Edward was nervous and emotional to learn he would meet the granddaughter named in honor of his lost daughter. When Emily Helen arrived, the resemblance to the old photographs of Mary Grace was striking. The same sweet expression, the same expressive eyes, the same warm smile. Thomas Edward cried when he saw her. "Grandpa," she said, hugging him, "thank you for never giving up on seeking justice for our family, even when it took decades, even when it seemed impossible." "It wasn't me who sought it, my granddaughter. It was Mrs. Margaret who had the courage to stir up the past. I had already given up." Emily Helen turned to Margaret. "Mrs. Margaret, I don't know how to thank you for what you did for my family. Because of your courage, I grew up knowing that my grandfather wasn't a failure who lost everything, but a victim of injustice, who managed to see restitution in his own lifetime." The young woman had brought family photos that Thomas Edward didn't know. Pictures of John graduating as an engineer, of Charles getting married, of the great-grandchildren he had only recently met. She also brought documents she had found in the family archive, including letters that Mary Grace had written to distant relatives telling of the plans for the farm. "One of the things that impresses me most about your story," said Emily Helen during lunch, "is how you managed to turn a conflict that could have generated eternal resentment into a partnership based on mutual respect." "It wasn't easy," replied Margaret. "In the beginning I felt too guilty, and your grandfather was too resigned. It took time for us to find a balance." "How did you manage it?" Thomas Edward answered. "We focused on the future instead of the past. Instead of dwelling on who had done what to whom, we started thinking about what we could do together to prevent other families from going through what we went through." Emily Helen asked many questions about the details of the legal process, about how they had structured the restitution program, about the difficulties encountered and the lessons learned. But she also wanted to know about more personal aspects, how their personalities had changed, how their families had reacted, how they had dealt with the public exposure. "One thing that intrigues me," she said, "is how you maintained a humanized perspective on an issue that could have become purely technical or legal. I think it's because we never lost sight of the fact that we were dealing with real families, not abstract cases," replied Margaret. "Every document represented shattered dreams. Every case represented people who had carried pain for decades. Besides," added Thomas Edward, "when you yourself have gone through suffering, it's hard to dehumanize the suffering of others." Emily Helen spent 3 days at the farm, documenting everything, recording interviews, photographing the memorial and the trees planted in honor of her aunt and grandmother. On the last day, she asked to plant a 3rd tree. "For whom?" asked Margaret. "For the 2 of you, so that future generations remember that there were courageous people who chose to do what was right, even when it was difficult." They planted a mango tree, chosen because it was a tree that bore large, sweet fruit, capable of feeding many people. Emily Helen explained that she saw the mango tree as a symbol of the generosity that had characterized Margaret and Thomas Edward's quest for justice. In the book Emily Helen later wrote, titled Roots of Justice, she dedicated the final chapter to the lessons that the story of her grandfather and Margaret offered for contemporary conflicts. They proved, wrote Emily Helen, that it is possible to find human solutions to human problems. That justice does not have to mean revenge and that truth does not have to mean destruction. They showed that ordinary people, motivated by courage and compassion, can create extraordinary change. The book became a bestseller in the non-fiction category and was adopted as required reading in law and social science courses at several universities. More importantly for Margaret and Thomas Edward, the book's royalties were donated in full to expand the Historical Restitution Fund. 2 years after the book's publication, when Margaret had turned 81 and Thomas Edward 84, they received an unusual invitation. An international human rights organization invited them to speak at a conference on transitional justice in South Africa. "Us? Speak to people from other countries?" questioned Thomas Edward. "I barely finished grade school." "It's not about formal education, Thomas Edward," explained Dr. Richard, who had facilitated the invitation. "It's about real-world experience. You have something that isn't learned at university: moral credibility and practical experience in resolving conflicts through dialogue and reparation." After much hesitation, they accepted the invitation. The trip to South Africa would be the first time Thomas Edward had left the United States, and only the second time Margaret had been on an airplane. The conference was held in Johannesburg, at a prestigious university where authorities from various countries discussed ways to address historical injustices without creating new conflicts. Margaret and Thomas Edward felt intimidated initially, surrounded by diplomats, academics, and international officials. But when it was their turn to speak, the simplicity and authenticity of their words deeply moved the audience. Thomas Edward told his personal story, from being expelled from the farm to finding justice decades later. Margaret explained how she had discovered the truth and why she had chosen to seek reparation instead of maintaining silence. During the Q&A session, a delegate from Kenya made an observation that deeply marked them. "You have achieved something many countries struggle to attain, transforming historical injustice into an opportunity for reconciliation. How did you do this as ordinary people, without special resources or specialized training?" Margaret answered spontaneously, "I think it's because we never forgot that on the other side were people like us. Thomas Edward wasn't an enemy I needed to defeat. He was a person who had suffered and deserved justice. I wasn't a villain he needed to punish. I was a person who had discovered the truth and wanted to do what was right." Thomas Edward added, "And because we understood that justice isn't about winning or losing. Justice is about finding a path where everyone can live with dignity." After the conference, several organizations approached them for consulting on similar cases. They declined most invitations, preferring to stay focused on the local United States reality, but they agreed to participate in some video conferences to share experiences with groups from other countries. Back in the United States, they found that their farm had become a destination for justice tourism. People from various parts of the country came to see the place where the miracle of reconciliation had happened. Margaret was initially uncomfortable with the attention, but Thomas Edward convinced her to see it as an educational opportunity. "If our story can inspire other people to seek peaceful solutions for their conflicts, the loss of privacy is worth it." They began offering guided tours once a month, always on Saturdays. Thomas Edward would tell the original story. Margaret would explain how she had discovered the truth and made her decisions, and together they would show the memorial and the planted trees. The tours always ended with a conversation circle under the mango tree planted by Emily Helen, where visitors could ask questions and share their own experiences with family, community, or personal conflicts. One of these visits was particularly memorable. A group of university students came accompanied by a professor who was researching conflict mediation. After hearing the whole story, a young psychology student asked a question that surprised everyone. "Do you think you could have done the same thing if you were younger?" Margaret and Thomas Edward looked at each other, thinking about the answer. "Good question," said Thomas Edward. "When you're younger, you're in more of a hurry, have more anger, more need to be right. Maybe we wouldn't have had the patience to listen to each other like we did. On the other hand, added Margaret, when you're older, you have less time to waste on resentments. You know life is too short to waste on hatred, the student insisted. But do you think young people can learn these reconciliation skills? They can and they should, replied Margaret, but perhaps they need examples, stories like ours, to show that it's possible. That's why we welcome you here. This conversation motivated Margaret and Thomas Edward Miller to develop a specific program for schools. They began visiting high schools in the region, telling their story, and promoting discussions on how to resolve conflicts without violence. The impact of the educational program exceeded expectations. Teachers reported that students were applying the lessons learned to resolve family and community conflicts. One school created a reconciliation council, based on the principles Margaret and Thomas Edward had demonstrated. 10 years after the discovery of the box, Margaret's farm was unrecognizable. Where once there was only a banana plantation tended by a lonely widow, now stood a leading center for restorative justice, a nationally respected memorial, and a thriving plantation cared for by a community of people united by a common purpose. Thomas Edward had moved into a small house at the back of Margaret's property. Officially, he was the farm's caretaker. Unofficially, he was a partner, friend, and co-founder of the entire movement that had been born there. Their children and grandchildren had become close friends. The children grew up hearing the story of how a hole in the ground had revealed secrets that changed two families for the better. For them, it was natural that conflicts could be resolved through conversation, understanding, and compromise. One day, Thomas Edward's great-granddaughter, now 8 years old, asked Margaret, "Grandma Margaret," she had spontaneously started calling her that, "if you hadn't found that box, what would have happened?" "I don't know, dear. Perhaps I would have lived the rest of my life without knowing the truth. Perhaps your great-grandfather would have died without seeing justice. Perhaps other families would never have received reparation. So was it good that you found it?" "Yes, it was. Sometimes good things come from difficult discoveries." The girl thought for a moment. "Grandma Margaret, if I find something buried in my backyard, should I tell everyone like you did?" Margaret smiled. "It depends on what you find, dear, but always remember, the truth may hurt at first, but it's always better than living a lie." That night, Margaret recounted the conversation to Thomas Edward. The two laughed, imagining the girl digging up her backyard in search of buried secrets. "I hope she doesn't find anything more dramatic than chicken bones buried by the dog," joked Thomas Edward. "I hope she grows up with the courage to face any truth she finds in life," replied Margaret, more seriously. "I think she will. She's growing up in a family that learned to value truth and justice above comfort and silence." 2 years later, when Margaret turned 83, her children organized a surprise party at the farm. Relatives came from various cities, old and new friends, beneficiaries of the reparation program, local authorities, and even Dr. Richard and Emily Helen. During the party, the current mayor of the town made an official speech, declaring Margaret the most illustrious citizen of the municipality, and announcing that the road leading to the farm would be renamed Carmem Silver Reconciliation Road. Thomas Edward was honored as a symbol of dignity in adversity and received a medal from the city council. In his acceptance speech, he said something that deeply touched everyone present. "This medal is not mine. It belongs to all the families who suffered injustices and never lost hope of seeing reparation. It belongs to my wife, Mary Grace, who had the wisdom to preserve the evidence when I had lost faith. It belongs to my daughter, Emily, whose memory inspires us to fight for a more just world. And it belongs to Mrs. Margaret, who proved that moral courage is worth more than any material wealth." The most moving moment of the celebration was when the children present performed a short play they had created about the story of Margaret and Thomas Edward. They reenacted the key moments: the discovery of the box, the first meeting between the two, the decision to seek justice, and the planting of the memorial trees. In the final scene, the children sang a song they had composed. In the red earth, a box was found, with old papers and a picture round Mrs. Margaret found it and did not flee. Truth brought pain, but justice grew free. Thomas Edward suffered but did not strike back. With Mrs. Margaret, he planted peace where there was lack, where there was pain, forgiveness was born, where there was hatred, unity was sworn. There wasn't a dry eye in the audience when the children finished singing. For Margaret and Thomas Edward, seeing that their story had become a lesson about the importance of courage and compassion was more rewarding than any official honor. After the celebration, when they had already said goodbye to all the guests, Margaret and Thomas Edward sat one last time under the 3 memorial trees. Emily's jaboticaba tree was laden with fruit, Mary Grace's pomegranate tree showed some new shoots, and the mango tree planted in honor of the 2 of them had grown strong and tall. "Thomas Edward," said Margaret, "if you could go back in time and change something about our story, what would you change?" He thought for a long time before answering. "I would change my family's suffering. I would make it so Emily could have grown up, so Mary Grace could have lived to see her grandchildren, so my children could have grown up in the land where they were born. But I would not change having met you. I would not change our friendship. I would not change the good we managed to do together." "And you, Mrs. Margaret, what would you change?" "I would change the fact that Harold lied to me for so many years. I wish he had trusted me enough to share the burden of guilt. Perhaps we could have sought redress much earlier, but I would not change having discovered the truth. I would not change our friendship. I would not change anything we built together. So we are at peace with our story. We are at peace with our story. And more importantly, we are at peace with each other and with ourselves." That night, for the last time in the story that began with the finding of a buried box, Margaret slept alone at the farm. Starting the next day, Thomas Edward's granddaughter, Emily Helen, would come to live with her to help care for the property and continue the educational work they had developed. Thomas Edward's health was more fragile, and he needed more constant care, so he would move to his son John's house in Atlanta. But he promised to keep visiting the farm whenever possible, and to remain involved in the redress program as long as his strength allowed. It was the end of one chapter of the story, but not the end of the story itself. What had begun as an accidental discovery had transformed into a philosophy of life, a model of justice, and a source of inspiration for people facing their own conflicts and moral dilemmas. The buried box had revealed much more than old documents. It had revealed the human capacity to transform pain into purpose, injustice into positive action, and conflict into reconciliation. It had proven that ordinary people, moved by courage and compassion, could create extraordinary change in their communities and even in their country. But perhaps the most important lesson from the story of Margaret and Thomas Edward was simple, that it is never too late to do what is right, and that true courage is not the absence of fear, but the willingness to act rightly in spite of fear. The red soil of the farm remained fertile, the banana trees kept bearing fruit, and the 3 memorial trees kept growing. The difference was that now everything there told a story about the importance of facing the truth, no matter how difficult, and about the transformative power of justice when applied with wisdom and compassion. End of story. And you, dear listener, what would you do if you found a buried box revealing painful secrets about your family? Could you muster the courage of Margaret to seek the truth and pursue justice? Share your thoughts on this moving story with us in the comments. Leave a like if the story touched you, and most importantly, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss other inspiring stories like this one. Thank you for joining us.